Welcome everyone, to today's University of Texas Energy Symposium. I'm Kerry King, Research Scientist and Assistant Director at the Energy Institute here at UT Austin. Welcome, everyone. Before I introduce formally today's speaker, I will introduce the upcoming talks. Next week, we will have Joe DeCarolis, who is the former administrator of the Energy Information Administration under President Biden, and he's now a head and professor of the Department of Engineering and Public Policy at Carnegie Mellon University. He will give us some of his thoughts about being the administrator of the EIA in a time of rapid change. We will not have a talk 2 weeks. In 3 weeks, we'll have another talk from Sarah Efte-Carnejad, who is an associate professor of electrical engineering at Syracuse, and she will talk about essentially grid dynamics and integrating renewables into the grid. But today, it is a pleasure to have Kelly Sims Gallagher, who's the dean of the Fletcher School at Tufts University. The title of her talk, Shifting Priorities in U.S. Energy Innovation Policy. A little background on Dr. Gallagher. She's also professor of energy and environmental policy at Tufts and co-directs the Climate Policy Lab and the Center for International Environment and Resource Policy at Fletcher School. She served in the second term of the Obama administration as the senior policy advisor in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, also as senior China advisor in the Special Envoy for Climate Change Office at the U.S. Department of State. She's also a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, a member of the board of the Belfer Center on Science and International Affairs at Harvard, and is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, the National Committee on U.S. China Relations. Broadly, her research focuses on U.S. China relations, green industrialization, climate policy, energy innovation, and low-carbon resilient models for sustainable prosperity. She's author of 3 books here listed by MIT Press: Titans of the Climate, 2018, The Global Diffusion of Clean Energy Technologies and Lessons from China, 2014, China Shifts Gears in 2006. Without said, I will now hand it over to Kelly. The floor is yours for today's symposium.
All right, thank you, Carrie. I really appreciate the invitation to speak to all of you, and although we're not in person, it's great to be here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now.
Go ahead. I'll interject. So everyone, we'll have a rough hard stop at an hour for the total symposium. So a hard stop at 1:30 Central Time. So please submit your questions for Kelly during the presentation, and we'll try to ask them at the end.
Great. And Carrie, does this look, are we in full screen here?
Looks good. Yes. Thank you.
All right, good. So before I get going, let me just say a word about the Fletcher School, just to orient all of you. Fletcher School was founded in 1933. We're a graduate school of international affairs with degree programs in international affairs, international law, and global business. I have been on the faculty as a professor of energy and environmental policy since 2009. And this work derives from the Climate Policy Lab that I co-founded in 2016. So a lot of the work I'm drawing on here comes from data sets that we've developed in the lab. And I specifically want to acknowledge one of my doctoral students, So-Young Oh, who has been working with me on a long-term project, kind of comparing different types of data related to energy innovation across different countries. And the context I want to start with is, where does the US sit relative to other countries in terms of its energy innovation effort and outcomes? And first, I want to just remind those of you who might not have taken economics in a while, how we think about comparative advantage. Formal definition proposed by Michael Porter in 1990 is that competitive advantage refers to the ability of a nation's industry or a specific domestic firm within that industry to gain a competitive advantage over foreign competitors. And let me advance here. Drawing from this data set, UN Comtrade, we can see U.S. competitive advantage in low carbon technology products over time, dating back to 1998, with the most recent year being 2023. And here the story, if you take some time to look at this, the United States is the sort of turquoise color, China is the red color, Japan is gray, Germany is dark, I don't know, the middle blue, South Korea is the navy blue, and UK is the beige color. And I think the trend here is that the United States has been on a downward trend in terms of its comparative advantage, and is currently in last place among this set of countries. China had this dramatic rise from the late 1990s until about 2010, which just happened to be when I was working on my book on the globalization of clean energy technologies. And then you can see it has basically plateaued since then, and possibly, but we'll be able to see with more data soon, is on an upward trajectory. Um, while there's a lot of discussion about China being sort of the country to beat, if you look at this chart, you can see that actually Japan and Germany are in the leading positions, with the UK in third place, followed closely by South Korea. Now, if you look at the trade balance, we see a slightly different picture. Here you can see the trade balance showing China's strength. So China is not only a net exporter, but the most pronounced net exporter today in low carbon technology products. And the United States is in the worst position as a net importer. UK is also a net importer. And you can see that South Korea's position has been declining, and Germany and Japan still seem to be more or less in the fight. So, turning now to the US position, we have been trying to track how the United States is doing in clean energy technology relative to China and also other countries. So you can see the U.S. China comparison in the two central columns. We then added the assessment that the U.S. Department of Energy did during the Biden administration on U.S. competitiveness in these individual technology areas. And then some notes on the side that we have sort of assembled in terms of how other countries or regions are doing. And I think interestingly, under the Biden administration, the Department of Energy's own assessment was that the US was not competitive in the global market in many of these clean energy categories. And according to DOE at the time, it was potentially competitive in wind energy equipment, onshore only, hydropower turbines and generators, nuclear power plant construction, and I'm going to talk about a little bit more on the next page, next slide. And for onshore wind, the US was competitive in the production of towers, foundations, certain types of assembly, and blade subcomponents. If we just continue and look at these other technologies, you can see that the US was viewed to be competitive in lithium-ion battery module packs, racks, manufacturing and reuse of battery cells, CCUS, and hydrogen. So overall, the picture seemed kind of bleak at that time. And I think the data, pretty clearly shows as you kind of stare at the comparisons between the US and China in these different domains, and then also look also at how these other countries are doing, that the United States, in many ways, is sort of, at the time at least, sort of falling behind in these clean energy and energy domains. Now, no surprise to anybody, it's very clear that the Trump administration is not prioritizing clean energy technology other than, I think, nuclear and geothermal. I'll come to this a little bit more. It has also more or less abandoned carbon capture and storage, with some remaining interest, I think, in biofuels and hydrogen. Um, but the Trump administration is definitely devaluing, I think, the clean energy domain. With respect to RD&D investments, this is something I have tracked for a long time, especially in the United States, and more recently trying to do international comparisons. And the reason why I'm so interested and think that RD&D, public R&D investments are a useful metric is that they are really a leading indicator of the intentions and beliefs about the future energy technologies that a country will be using. So if a country is investing a lot of money in nuclear, for example, as India does, you would expect that that country is planning on a nuclear dominated future. And India, by the way, just happens to be fascinating to me because it has put most of its RD&D investments in nuclear, but its deployment currently is largely prioritizing solar, not nuclear. And so that's a little bit of a dissonance. This slide is just comparing the United States, China, and France, Japan, Germany, the UK, and India. So these are the largest funders, public funders of energy research, development, and demonstration around the world. And you can see that historically and still today, the United States accounts for the largest fraction of RD&D investments. So you can see that on the left-hand side. And today is closely followed by China. The data for China are very difficult to obtain, so I don't have high confidence. It may be that China has now surpassed the United States, but it may not be. We just don't know for sure. You can also see there was a pronounced uptick that was driven by the United States. That's the bump in 2009. And this was the very rapid growth in RD&D investments under the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act during the Obama administration. This was included as part of the stimulus, essentially, the Obama stimulus. And as you can see, it was a short-lived temporary infusion of dollars. Looking at the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, you can see this comparison of U.S. and Chinese government energy RD&D. And one of the things that's difficult to discern about China is that if you include China's state-owned energy investments, state-owned energy company investments, you can see that overall China far surpasses the United States. But if you take out the state-owned energy company investments, you can see that overall Chinese government investment is smaller. If you include only clean energy, non-nuclear, China is in the leading position. If you include clean energy plus nuclear, the United States has a slight edge over China, according to the latest data we have. This is the current picture for the United States. So here you can see this is our entire data set going back to 1978. I've maintained this for a number of years with Laura Diaz-Anadon from now Cambridge University. And you can see that in constant dollars, the United States has declined, except for that one really pronounced period in 2009 with the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act, relative to where the United States was in the late 1970s in the wake of the oil crises. This seems particularly salient today, given the conflict in the Middle East, and kind of begs the question about whether, due to that conflict, we may end up mobilizing additional dollars um, for energy RD&D in the United States in the future. But up until this year, so throughout the first Trump administration and the Biden administration, you could see we actually had modest and reasonably steady increases overall. And then you can also see that the composition of the investments did not change that much over time. So fission being red, fusion being orange, efficiency being yellow, renewables being the bright blue, fossil, including clean coal technologies, which included carbon capture and storage, being purple, electricity, transmission and distribution, green, and hydrogen, being the dark blue, and then the new ARPA-E, which is a diversified portfolio, being the pink. The Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations never really took off, but there's little bits at the very top, which you can't even, I don't think, see. And then most notably, you should be able to see what happened this year, the first year of the Trump administration's budget request. So the Trump administration requested or proposed to Congress to cut U.S. Energy RD&D spending in half, approximately in half. It virtually eliminated efficiency and renewables investments, and you can see, relatively speaking, prioritized fission and fusion, electricity transmission and distribution, and hydrogen. And we now know, I'll get to what has happened since their budget request, but I also just wanted to make this point, which is that cumulatively, if you look back from 1985 to 2026, you can see that the U.S. portfolio has actually been a very diversified portfolio over time. Yes, there have been year-to-year changes, and as we've gone from Democratic to Republican administration and back, we have not actually seen, really big fluctuations. That's maybe more obvious if you look at this chart. But if you look at the sort of cumulative totals, you can see a pretty diversified portfolio over time. So now if we turn to the outcomes this year, now that Congress has finalized the budget and President Trump has signed it, overall, Congress essentially rejected President Trump's budget request. And in the end, there's a 2% cut overall for the Department of Energy. But we do see some pretty dramatic shifts in the composition of that investment. So much more money for basic energy sciences, advanced computing, and nuclear security, not necessarily civilian nuclear energy. Pretty substantial cuts for wind, solar, even for conventional fossil, although under the Biden administration, that was largely what was called carbon management at the time. The Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations is eliminated, and ARPA-E is reduced by a quarter. And we see modest increases in funding for nuclear energy, geothermal, what they call water power, and nuclear security. So I think this gives us a lot of information about what to expect for the next 4 years. It was unclear to me going into this budget cycle whether Congress was going to uphold its kind of traditional bipartisan consensus for energy technology innovation or not, and whether this particular Congress was going to substantially alter the composition of that investment. And we can see that overall, um, Congress did uphold the DOE's budget, though much more money is going for nuclear security than the sort of innovation side of DOE. And indeed, we're seeing some pretty substantial changes in the composition um, of the portfolio. Now, moving beyond R&D to actual deployment of technologies, this slide from the IEA gives us a good picture, I think, of the different investment in clean energy capacity. And you can see that China is in the lead with very substantial investments. Most of China's fossil investment is coal because, as I'm sure most of you know, China does not have substantial oil and gas to exploit. The rest of the portfolio for China is largely a renewables and efficiency portfolio with very substantial investments also in grids and storage. On my last trip to China, a little over a year ago, I went and visited one of China's new grid storage sites. So they actually have grid level storage at this point. But the United States is not as far behind as I think some people think. Most of the US fossil investment, of course, is natural gas and oil, but still pretty substantial renewables, grid, and efficiency investments. And then you can see the rest of the world falling in behind. In terms of US electricity capacity additions, we see a strikingly different portfolio than the innovation portfolio for 2026. So this is the projected electricity capacity additions according to EIA's inventory of what's in the pipeline for 2026. And here I think you can see 93% of the projected electricity capacity additions will be clean energy, specifically solar, batteries, and wind, based on what's in the pipeline. Another indicator that can give us a sense of how we're doing, how the US is doing relative to other countries is patents. And I want to make the important caveat that patents are not a great indicator of innovation capacity, but they are a good indicator of effort. And here you can see the tremendous effort made by China, which is the teal color on the top of this bar graph during the last 20 years. Across all categories. You can just see China has been making efforts to file patents in every single one of these different categories. The United States is the dark pink color at the bottom. And so what you can see from this graph is that the United States' most prominent efforts have been in batteries, PV, solar cells, and energy efficiency. So again, this is like kind of a cumulative picture of effort, and it is a little bit different than the investments in RD&D. I also wanted to mention electric vehicles because I think this is an important thing to think about. And I recently published a sort of more of an op-ed style article in the conversation about the risks that I think the U.S. auto industry are facing with respect to its own innovation capacity in electric vehicles. So what this picture shows is that the U.S. is way behind China in terms of the EV share of new passenger car sales. The on the top, I know this is a little bit of a confusing graph, but there's a lot of great information in it. On the top is 2019, and then the bottom is 2025. And you can see as of 2019, the United States and China were kind of in a similar position between 0 and 10% of total EV sales as a share of total passenger car sales. But by 2025, you can see China has pulled way ahead and has now crossed the 50% threshold, and its magnitude has grown quite dramatically as well, as shown by the size of that circle. And the United States is way back, still stuck around 10%. And the other thing I want to point out is that other countries have really surged ahead, some kind of surprising ones. So Vietnam is now close to 40%, Ethiopia nearly 60%. And for those who've been watching this for a while, maybe less surprising that Norway is close to 100% of EV sales as a fraction of total passenger car sales. So this is just another indicator, I think, of the U.S. not having the same sense of commitment and urgency to move to these cleaner energy technologies. So how is all of this shaped by the policy environment? To remind you all of the sort of progression of legislation under President Biden. We had first the Energy Act of 2020, which extended clean energy tax credits and added quite a good amount of authorization of funding for low carbon technologies. Then the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law of 2021, which had obviously infrastructure investments, and in particular, I think national EV charging and grid upgrade investments. And then the CHIPS and Science Act, which had substantial new authorizations for RD&D. And then probably most importantly, the Inflation Reduction Act, which created very substantial tax credits, investment tax credits, production tax credits, grants and loans to incentivize the construction, operation, and purchase of low carbon technologies and infrastructure. As I'm sure you all know, the Inflation Reduction Act remains law, but implementation has been uneven. Most of the climate grants have been revoked. All of the environmental justice grants were revoked. The office overseeing implementation has been eliminated. A lot of the provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act were affected or essentially replaced by the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. And there we had 4 million acres of federal land opened up to coal leasing and royalties cut from 12 to 8%. The EV credits, which were restricted, I'll just remind you, to U.S. automaker, cars, EVs produced in the United States, were repealed after September 30th. Home efficiency technology credits repealed as of December 31. The clean energy investment production tax credits repealed as of December 31, or depending on the specific credit, later this year in 2026. But interestingly, carbon sequestration, nuclear, and biofuels credits were preserved or enhanced. We definitely are seeing a comprehensive regulatory retreat. I think exemplified best by the recent repeal of the greenhouse gas endangerment finding, and the nullification of the vehicle emissions known as the CAFE standards. Well, we have technically both of them, both of which have been um, removed. And then the budget request that we saw, which drastically cut energy RD&D. So clearly under the Trump administration, the priority is on production of oil and gas. They're not substantially increasing RD&D investment in that domain, but in terms of deployment, the priority is really oil and gas. And I think, at least theoretically, promotion of coal, though we haven't seen substantial move to increase coal generation of electricity from coal. So let me summarize with the hope that I've left enough time for questions. By saying that, I think we have a substantial risk of eroding U.S. competitiveness in clean technology versus Japan, Korea, Germany, and China. It does appear that U.S. government innovation investment priorities are shifting away from wind and solar, at least. There isn't much evidence that the Trump administration is even interested in storage, which was, I think, maybe an area that I thought that the U.S. had a fighting chance to really succeed in. But I think, interestingly, we're seeing that the private sector is still seeming somewhat bullish on clean tech deployment in the United States, at least in terms of electricity generation. I think the private sector is less bullish in terms of electric vehicle deployment, and we can see that through the cancellation of some of the new electric vehicle and battery factories that were planned by the U.S. big three automakers. This is an obvious point, but I think it's an important one worth stating, which is that these really wild swings that we're seeing from Democratic to Republican administration in energy policy. First of all, I think those swings are getting more dramatic over time. They were very modest swings. Maybe if we think back to the first Bush administration, to the Clinton, to the second Bush. But now I would say those swings are really dramatic and most obvious from Trump to Biden to Trump. And these swings create a very challenging and unpredictable market environment for American entrepreneurs and U.S. industry. And then finally, another danger, which is hard for me to substantiate because we don't have a lot of data yet, is that the future of U.S. innovation talent is challenged by the Trump administration's approach to higher education with the cancellation of research grants and the limitations on international visas. And with that, I will stop sharing and open it up for questions and comments.
All right. Yes, thank you very much. All right, we have some have a few questions coming in. Maybe I'll start with one. I guess in terms of, well, I don't know, maybe it's not so much an innovation question, just thinking about, importing and exporting of energy or energy related technologies, and thinking about the capabilities of countries. I guess the U.S. now net exporter of oil and natural gas, and the Trump administration talks about this as, or perhaps many people, is presenting some strength of the United States and ability to sell natural gas to Europe if they get cut off from Russia. So how do we think about that kind of trade-off of selling, I don't know, this commodity or maybe fossil fuels versus being able to produce other technologies, solar panels, batteries, and this kind of thing? Is it really a trade-off? Do we have to pick one or the other? Can you do it all? I don't know. General question there.
Yeah, well, I think that the United States has demonstrated that it certainly has the capacity and the appetite to export the commodity side of the equation, right? Whether it's coal, oil, or gas. Um, and, I was recently at the Munich Security Conference in Europe and was really struck there by conversations I was in by how quickly the Europeans have become reliant on the United States for LNG, um, and in general overall for natural gas, and how concerned they are in this moment about whether they have sort of switched from a dangerous reliance on Russia to a dangerous reliance on the United States, because there was a lot of concern, and I got many questions that were unanswerable about whether I thought that the Trump administration would impose export controls on LNG if gas prices started to rise in the United States. And
Right.
here we are with gas prices starting to rise in the United States. So we'll be able to see what happens. But I think, given President Trump's appetite to impose as much leverage on other countries as possible, as we've seen in his tariff negotiations, I think it is conceivable, at least, that the United States might impose export controls on LNG if gas prices rise substantially, and that'll be really tricky in the current environment because after all. There's going to be acute shortages in the near term. Well, much will depend on how long this current conflict lasts, with respect to the sort of the long-term shortages from Qatar and other gas-producing countries
Right.
in the Middle East.
Right.
Yeah, so I don't know if that answers your
That's
question, but
fine. Yeah,
yeah.
some questions here from the audience are, well, in some sense, we'll keep touching loosely on these topics, as you might imagine. So one here, it's just kind of a maybe general high level question. What are the effect, do you think, of Trump's tariff strategy impacting private sector investments in clean energy? Maybe we've seen some things, maybe we haven't seen everything yet. So how do we think about, or what do we know about
Yeah, I think that's a great question because essentially we have two different philosophies about sort of promoting U.S. competitiveness from the Biden administration to the Trump administration. And the tools of choice are quite different. So in the Biden administration, the tools of choice were tax incentives. And in the Trump administration, the tool of choice is tariffs. Um, Obviously, we had a second differentiation, which is the Biden administration was trying to promote the onshoring of manufacturing jobs in clean technology industries, most notably in electric vehicles and batteries, but I think to the extent possible, also in clean electricity technologies as well. Um, and I would say what can we learn from other countries and I'm thinking about China, Japan, Korea in particular, and their sort of philosophies about industrial policy. Because don't forget, Japan and Korea are in a leading position, and also Germany. There, I think what we see is that those countries often use a mix of both um, tariffs or domestic um, industry protection, and also tax incentives, loans, other fiscal policies to protect their infant industries. But then the difference is, and this is sort of the classic East Asian industrial policy, they gradually expose those firms to international competition. So they're not going to get support from the state without meeting certain performance requirements, or and sometimes those performance requirements are very explicitly framed around exports. Um, So I think that's a big difference that I notice in the United States is that we don't impose performance requirements on US firms. Biden failed to do that. I was critical of the Biden administration for just subsidizing without imposing those performance requirements. And I feel concerned, I think, in the Trump administration's case that they took away all the subsidies for the clean energy manufacturing because President Trump hates clean energy. Um, and so I think a lot of the factories that had started construction, are obviously closing down. And it doesn't seem like tariffs alone are sufficient um, to keep these new factories from continuing to be constructed.
Right. Your statement of the typical Southeast or East Asian philosophy seems to make sense. If you want to be good at something, then you need to make a lot of it, or perhaps, the learning by doing effect. You get better as you
Mhm.
do it. And if you want to make sure that someone can buy the product that you're learning how to make, then you make it harder for your citizenry to buy somebody else's product for a
Right.
while and then open up. But your interesting question, it was try not to go too long. Had some other questions, but you brought up, yeah, why does the United States in general, whether it's Biden administration or anyone, not like to impose requirements on or some sort of performance requirements on U.S. firms or innovation? Is that you have any feeling for that? Is that we just US, we think we're the best at everything and we make the best products. So why would you put a performance requirement on me? Because I'm going to do great and probably beat your performance anyway. So there's no point. I don't know. That's the first
Well,
thing that came to my mind, but
I think we have a lot of faith in the United States, which is well-placed faith, that if we can just incentivize innovation, and by that, I think we tend to think of that as invention, right? If we can
Mhm.
just incentivize innovation, the market will work. We have a lot of faith in the market. And so it's kind of a supply side approach, right? We're going to invest in, through our R&D investments, innovation, and then those that are worthy are going to penetrate the marketplace. And I think that that's frankly a little bit naive if we look at the what actually happened with respect to some of the renewables and how the cost of those renewables came down. There, I think we have to look at um, the story in Germany with the very early passage in 2000 of Germany's renewable energy law, which created a market for renewable energy technologies. The feed-in tariffs that Germany pioneered and Spain took on, which proved very expensive for those countries, but again created the first global market for renewables that the Chinese recognized and decided they were going to try to serve those markets. And then the Chinese really jumped into the manufacturing of these technologies, looking at exporting to these markets and also to the United States. So to the extent we were doing this in the United States, it was at the state level, not at the federal level. I would say the other bias we have in the United States, and I think this is just a function of what's politically easiest to get past, is using fiscal tools. And so Congress, I think, would much prefer a fiscal approach. So production tax credits, investment tax credits, loans, loan guarantees. Those have been the tools that the federal government has um, consistently used and that Congress has authorized for use across, on a bipartisan basis, really um, up until this administration. And I think thanks to those, we did make some progress in creating some incentives, but they were very inconsistent. Think about how often the production tax credit for solar expired and had to be reauthorized,
Right.
and so we didn't have the stability of policy in the marketplace that some of our competitor countries have had And I do think that's made it much harder for US firms to compete.
Right. Yeah, I think of things the U.S. government, or at least the federal level policy, particularly in, I guess, targets for biofuels, which aren't maybe exactly metrics for innovation, but targets for acquisition that proved difficult to beat. And yeah, it's good to understand the difference between the technologies and the things that really matter, photovoltaics versus algae biofuels being pretty different in how they work, obviously. All right, so let's go to some of these others. Maybe here's the big picture one. Could you expand your thinking about how the war in Iran might affect global energy innovation? Or do we know anything about how war incentivizes countries to change their energy
Well,
tactics?
I quickly referenced this, maybe too obliquely. The last time we had a major incident, I guess, with Iran, uh, resulted in the establishment of the U.S. Department of Energy and the creation of our U.S. Energy RD&D programs. And at that time, we had very substantial, much, much larger investments, if you can remember that graph, like double what they are today in constant dollars. So I think that it is possible that not only here in the United States, but elsewhere around the world, as countries experience what I think is likely to be a pretty substantial price shock in oil and gas markets, at least in the near term. Um, and it all will depend on how long this conflict ensues. It might remind countries of the importance of energy security. And I think that, especially here in the United States, Americans have sort of forgotten about energy security because we have been so successful at increasing oil and gas production due to the shale revolution. Um, but back in the 1970s, before the advent of shale, these concerns about energy security were really prominent. And I think an important difference, and this is something I've noticed repeatedly in all of the work I do in China, is that because China does not have a lot of oil and gas, or at least accessible shale gas, it feels very energy insecure. This is also true for Japan and Korea, and I think now true for Germany. And so, in a way, it's unsurprising that they have invested as much as they have in renewables, because from their point of view, yes, there's a climate benefit or an emissions benefit, but in many respects, it's the most energy secure option available for them today. And so I do think that explains a lot about why those countries have sort of pulled ahead in these renewable and storage and electric vehicle technologies, because the energy security motivation was strong. I think the countries that are most likely to suffer, or that are going to suffer the most in the near term, are going to be the East Asian countries who rely so heavily on imports, specifically of gas, but also oil, um, from the Middle East.
Right. I'll remind the viewers, last week's talk by Aditya Ramji talked about electric vehicle production in China, largely in the global market, and we had similar discussion about motivations for China on electric vehicles versus maybe more than the United States, given what Dr. Gallagher has just said, that it's not as much oil and gas resource production in China. Okay, here's one you were talking about battery storage and referenced, according to the quote here and the question, some success in storage in the United States, at least in terms of installing storage at the grid scale now, and particularly here in Texas and ERCOT grid, it's increasing fast. So this is a question more to just kind of expand your thoughts on there. In terms of success, there's success in installation, there's success in being able to manufacture these technologies, and how do you think about that relative to China's dominance of sort of battery manufacturing capability, and perhaps rollbacks that you mentioned from the Biden administration trying to incentivize, well, at least chips, but I suppose batteries, I think we're in there as well.
Oh, big time. In fact, the most of the money that was attracted by the IRA incentives was actually in the domain of batteries. So most of the new investment money was going into batteries. Well, I think I meant success in storage in terms of the U.S. Having kind of the inherent innovation capability in energy storage. We have very strong capabilities in this domain. We had lost a lot of our manufacturing capabilities in batteries, and China has, relatively gained strength. But I want to remind you all how quickly that happened. So, I would say that Japan and the United States were the most prominent battery manufacturers back in 2010. And I always can kind of make a reference point for this because that's when I was doing the research in China for my globalization book. And at that time, I was visiting different battery factories in China, and they were all importing the materials and the technology from the United States at that time. So we're 16 years past that now. But in that, relatively speaking, very short amount of time, China has not only caught up to the United States, but arguably has surpassed the United States in terms of innovation capability and clearly in terms of manufacturing. I think the Biden administration was trying to revitalize U.S. domestic battery manufacturing, and I think did successfully implement a strategy because a lot of the investment was Japanese and Korean investment in new battery factories in the United States. Um, I can't remember if it was Kentucky or Tennessee, which state was supposed to have the most new battery factories under construction by the end of end of the Biden administration. Um, I was really enthusiastic about that because there is that very important learning by doing component to innovation. And if you're not manufacturing, you're essentially losing to some extent some of the knowledge about, how to improve process innovations and so forth. Um, and so, yeah, I think it was not only from an innovation point of view, but obviously more broadly also from a jobs, employment, economic growth point of view, exciting and strategic for the United States to be creating those incentives and starting to restart, battery manufacturing in the United States. So yeah, that's why I was enthusiastic. I think a lot of those, but not all, but a lot of those factories have now been canceled.
Right. I don't know if anybody's, yeah, I was about to say, do you have a feel for how many have been canceled, and maybe
I
they still
don't,
don't know yet?
I don't know all of them. I saw recently that Ford's plant, they're repurposing from electric batteries for electric vehicles to batteries for grid storage.
Right.
So that I don't know if that's emblematic of a broader trend, or how many have actually been canceled.
Right. Right. Okay. Well, this one maybe we'll wrap up. This could be an entire dissertation here.
I know.
I'm sure this other question here, but it's how you kind of ended your talk on this
Mm.
whip seesawing or whiplash of tech policy as we go from presidential administration from one to the other, and how you say it's getting worse. So,
Mhm.
how do we? This is a question from the attendee. How do we avoid this kind of whiplash? How do we, how far behind the curve, how much does innovation slow down because you're whiplashing, going back and forth between pro fossil versus pro renewables types of scenarios? Maybe it's impossible to answer. I don't know how people know about how much this changing of policy slows things down over decades.
Yeah. Well, I think how we avoid the whiplash is probably the most important question that we all need to think about. And although I worked in the Obama administration, I'm politically an independent. And I think what I would observe is that energy and climate policy has become increasingly partisan over, the last 20 years, basically during my career. And like I said, early in my career, the differences in policy were pretty modest from administration. I would argue that ideally, whoever is the next administration, the next Democratic administration to come in, try to find a more centrist path to energy policy, and it will probably be tempting for them, to be very corrective. But I would argue that in the longer run, it's better to have a more stable energy policy with bipartisan consensus than these crazy, back and forth policies, precisely because it really interrupts our longer term strategies and capabilities. Will we be far behind? I think in clean energy technologies, I think the answer is unfortunately yes. You can't sustain substantial reductions in RD&D. I mean, I'm sure UT Austin has experienced the same kind of federal budget cuts that we've experienced here at Tufts. Literally every grant that had the word climate or clean energy in it, I think, was canceled. So that of course hurts the faculty, the graduate students, capabilities to continue doing the research. And of course, the national labs are also experiencing these cuts in these certain specific domains. So, I think just purely on the innovation side, it's going to be harder, not impossible, but just harder for us to be able to sustain the research output during this period in clean energy technologies. And certainly the fact that a lot of these factories and plants aren't going forward means the United States will be that much further behind in the manufacturing know-how and kind of cutting edge advanced manufacturing techniques. So it's not I'm sorry to say, from a clean energy point of view, it's not really an encouraging picture right now. But I also have great faith in the United States' ability to reinvent itself. I mean, it has done this over and over again, and I think what we need to do is see where we can find bipartisan consensus, and then pursue a longer term strategy on that basis.
Right. See if that question, whether that bipartisan consensus requires a split party amongst the president and Congress, but we will see. Certainly a challenge in less federal government funding that can have maybe a longer term vision or not as many immediate outcomes that are desired, or as compared to maybe private sector funding and universities that might be looking for shorter term gains. With that said, we'll just end it right there. So thank you very much again. This has been Kelly Sims Gallagher as the Dean of the Fletcher School at Tufts University. Thanks for speaking with us on the University of Texas Energy Symposium.
Thanks very much for having me.
All right.